The Vikings greatly impacted modern-day English. Their history was not just a story of conquest and victory, but also one of linguistic importance. They left an imprint on grammar and vocabulary of the English language. Let's take a look into the historical background, vocabulary influence, and grammar influence of the Vikings. The Vikings seemed to start raiding all of a sudden, but there had been a climate change that increased survivability, and there were a lot of sons that were not firstborn coming to an age where they wanted some power to their name, so they went on raids. The first raids were not poorly organized, but quickly became very organized raids later on. Some Vikings set up camps on the main continent, from which they conducted more raids with increased frequency. Ultimately, these camps turned into towns and eventually more powerful nations as the Vikings living there settled down. However, the Vikings did not only raid, they also traded, and in some cases, they traded what they raided. The success of Vikings was heavily influenced on the design and specifications of their ships. Viking longships were designed with a draft as low as 32 inches and could be crewed by a few people, yet still carry many people. The ships were also durable enough to survive, but still be light enough to be dragged over land and small enough to go up and down rivers. Viking raids mainly focused on churches and monasteries because that was where the valuables were generally kept.
The language spoken by the Vikings is called Old Norse, also called Scandinavian. Old Norse and Old English both came from Germanic languages and are both part of the Indo-European family tree. It's because of this that the two languages are in many ways similar to each other, to the point that the Vikings and the English viewed each other not as foreigners but as distant relatives of Germanic tribes. But there were also many differences. A person who spoke Old Norse could roughly communicate with one who spoke Old English. It would probably get frustrating, but they are similar enough to be partially understood. There is also a strong relationship between the invasions of the Vikings and how that affected the English vocabulary. When the Vikings were entering places like England and France, they were mostly middle-class or lower-class farmers and workers. For this reason, they learned to speak in a more simple and common manner than those in a higher or elite position. The Vikings added commonly used words to our vocabulary. Some examples are window, skill, ugly, want, take, and husband. If we put the added vocabulary into context, we can see why farmers or workers ended up adding vocabulary words like scrub, scrape, raise, root, scathe, and more. One of the most notable effects the Vikings had on the vocabulary was they, them, and their. What happened was that when the Vikings were learning Old English, they found it complicated. Old English had several endings to make things nominative, genitive, dative, and many other cases. On top of that, the plural ending sounded very similar to the singular endings, like in the nominative. Since it was hard for the Vikings to learn Old English perfectly, they ended up dropping in the Viking pronouns instead. This led to the simpler pronouns they, them, and their.
Genetically speaking, English is a Low West Germanic language from the Indo-European family. The linguist Sir William Jones discovered that Greek and Latin shared many cognates with Sanskrit. This was something that came as a surprise to the European peoples of the time, and from this Sir William Jones conjectured the existence of one common early language that existed before and gave rise to many different and modern languages. This language is called Proto-Indo-European. The widespread distribution of languages that descended from Proto-European suggests that the speakers of this language somehow spread their language over large areas. There are two main theories as to how Proto-Indo-European speakers spread their language. The first is that they conquered their neighbors, spreading their language in that way, or that they moved around looking for better farmland, bringing their language with them and spreading it in that way.
The Vikings were a key factor in the development of the English language. They added words, changed pronunciations, and much more. But before we delve into that, I'll explain some of the context behind it. When the Vikings first met the Anglo-Saxons, their first task was to communicate with them. This was not so hard as Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, was very similar to Old English. For example, let's take the sentence, "Do you have a horse to sell?" In Old English, it would be "Hefst bu hors to selano," while in Norse, it would be "Hefir bu hros at selja." As you can see, the languages were close enough that the two groups could communicate. The two peoples would become closer in contact, and many of the Viking adults learned English. However, because they were adults, they spoke a version of English that was somewhat different than what the natives spoke. Many Viking men married the local women and taught their children the weird version of English. This event had a large impact on the English language. So, what exactly did the Vikings change? One major change in English was a shift from the case endings giving sentences their meaning to word order holding the importance. In light of this shift of importance, the stress, naturally, on words shifted away from the endings to the more important parts of the sentence. This shift in importance and stress caused the case endings to be more and more forgettable, and eventually they were dropped entirely. However, word change did not happen only because of the Vikings, as many other languages encountered by English were key factors in this. In the case of the Vikings, it was because the adults would learn the language in a strange way. Their languages were similar enough to communicate, so the Vikings kept all the words and parts of words that they understood and got meaning from. Also, the only way they could learn a language was by someone telling them the word for something, which would partially explain this simplification. Gradually, over time, the word endings and genders faded. Let's take a look at the Old English word stand, for example. As we see in this chart, there are 3 different endings for the 4 plural forms of the word: as, a, and um. However, the plural form in Middle English has only one ending, es. Many other words did the same thing, and as the endings became the same, there was no reason to keep them. Thus, word endings and genders faded away from their existence in the English language. Another important part of the argument is that the English language underwent the most drastic simplification in the north, where the Vikings were settled. Why is this? Changes in language like those of the Vikings are not possible without the other culture truly mixing with the natives. For example, the Normans ruled over the English, but ruled distantly without much contact to their people, so the rule had nearly no effect on the English language. In the Vikings' case, they were very densely populated among the English people, explaining why they were able to have such a great influence on English.
One major change from Old English to Middle English and then to Modern English is the simplification of the language each step along the way: the words, endings, and grammar. The explanation for why and how Old English began to simplify has to do with different people of different but related language groups living together. After King Alfred, the Danes and Saxons lived side by side for generations, generally in peace. Waves of Viking men came and learned their strange form of English, and, as such, the high-density population of Vikings were able to alter and simplify the English language. Both of their language have the same Germanic roots, and because of this, the language frontier gradually broke down. These contacting languages simplified in wake of the exploitation of the denominators of each language that both sides could understand. Thus, the language simplified. The simplification of 2 different but communicable languages that come in contact is called pidginization. This process that simplified Old English can be illustrated as such. One person who speaks Old English from the south of a country runs into someone from the northeast who speaks Old Norse. These 2 can definitely communicate. However, the complications and sophistications of each language is lost. The very basic, mutually understandable parts of each spoken sentence is understood. In other words, each individual can understand the main words from the other's language, but not the grammatical parts of the sentences. As a result, confusion can arise. For example, back to the example of the horse, but slightly different. If the Old English speaker wanted to say that, "I'll sell you the horse that pulls my cart," he would say, "Ek sella da horse that draggeth minne wagen." If the Old Norseman were to say the same thing, he would say, "Ek mun selka der horset es drager mein wagen meine." So in general, they can basically understand one another. Again, however, the grammar is lost. The Old Norse speaker understands the horse part, but cannot be sure about the number of whether 1 or 2. The 2 languages differ in this way of specifying numbers. If a lot of these confusing situations occur, as was in the case of the Danes and Saxons, the simplification of the language is greatly encouraged.
The English language in the present day would have been completely different without the intervention of the Vikings. From grammar to vocabulary, the language would have been much more complicated. Their tale of conquest and triumph, combined with their linguistic importance, makes them a very influential and interesting group.